Hello and welcome to the show. I am Martin Willis, your host, and we have a great show. One of my favorites is on tonight, Nick Redfern, and I'm the very first interview with him about his new book. I'm always excited to do that with Nick because he has so many great books out there. The title to this book is Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, UFOs, Russian Meddling, Soviet Spies, and Cold War Secrets. And a lot of people that listen to the show know that I have a little bit of an affinity for Russia. I know Russia's been in the bad news, in a bad way in the news often, but I have gone there many times. And it's an interesting culture. I've tried to research UFOs there. I'll talk to Nick a little bit about that. I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. Anyone can do that. You go over to podcastufo.com. That information's there. Our blog this week is by Charles Lear, is UFOs and School Children. He discusses not only like the Ariel school incident, which many times we talk about here, but all other cases that are known with school children. There's quite a few cases, and it's really fascinating. So check that out over at podcastufo.com. And I think that may be enough for right now. Alejandro, how are you?
Yes, sir. I'm doing well. How are you, my friend?
Good, good. Welcome to the show. And so lots cooking, as we talk about every week lately. Lots going on in the UFO world. And I don't know what you want to tackle first, but have at it.
Yeah, I guess I'll go down the list. At the beginning of the list that you'll find of the UFO headlines at openminds.tv is a great story from Tyler Rogaway. So we've both talked to him, and we've talked about him, because he is a defense writer in the mainstream. He writes for a site called The War Zone, and he's been writing about aerospace and aerospace technology for his entire life. And so that's why it's important for him to start writing about UFOs and getting involved in all of this. And people have been frustrated because he's been doing both. He's been talking about, maybe this is some secret tech that these Navy pilots have been seeing. And he's also, however, been kind of talking with pilots and putting together the facts. So you can kind of see his mindset, how he's struggling with what the heck could this be? It doesn't seem to be our tech, but is it? And he does a great job of making the point. If it is our tech, the maneuvers and what they describe these things doing is absolutely phenomenal. So I think the more significant story he's had lately, he's had two in the last week. One of them was, well, maybe they are seeing these airborne radar reflectors. Certainly that wouldn't account for all of the sightings that the Navy's having, especially the Tic Tacs. However, he also got a hold of one of these pilots that was just on this latest episode of Unidentified. These pilots who were part of the Roosevelt group, and 2015, the Roosevelt Strike Force, which is essentially the aircraft carrier. They were off the coast of Florida, and they saw these objects that seemed to follow them to Iran. And they saw this cube-shaped object inside of a clear sphere. He asked, other pilots, is this common? Is this something that others are seeing? And his story was, and the headline is, recent UFO encounters with Navy pilots occurred constantly across multiple squadrons. So he found out there's a lot more pilots than just this one small group that is reporting this sort of thing. And they are across multiple squadrons. So that this UFO phenomena is affecting, more pilots than just what have we heard, maybe 4 pilots so far, 4 or 5 on the Unidentified television show. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about that, especially now that the Navy has changed their rules to be kind of more pro-UFO, to be more open to having their pilots report UFO sightings. So that's pretty exciting. I think that's some really good work that he does there.
Yeah, I always like reading Tyler's work. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to also see the process that mainstream journalism goes through, especially someone like Tyler, who's open to the idea that there is something going on here, that these pilots are, accurately describing what they're encountering. And if they are, which he makes a point that, they've got to be, then what the heck is this? And you see that struggle that they're going through.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Both you and I have also talked to Calvin Parker, and this is pretty cool too. Calvin Parker was part of the Pascagoula incident, which happened in the 70s, where he and his buddy Charles Hickson had encountered these strange creatures. Now he's going to be speaking at the UFO Congress. However, there has been some really pretty neat news. Mississippi officials have commemorated his account. There's an NPR radio interview that you can listen to that we have a link to here. But yeah, kind of like Tom Reed, he's had some actual issues with this historical marker that commemorates his incident. But in New Hampshire, Betty and Barney Hills, their incident has been commemorated by a state marker. And now the Pascagoula case. So that's another important thing where kind of these historical societies across the country are open to, at least making these historical markers to mark these events, or at least the occurrence of these large cultural events, even if they're UFO or alien related. And I think you'll agree that Calvin Parker comes across as very credible. This is one of the more credible cases out there.
Absolutely. And just to think that he was, I have to give credit to Michael Loke, who wrote the blog from years ago. And basically, Calvin came out of many years of staying away and out of interviews. And he actually reached out to me initially several years ago after he read the blog, which is awesome because now he said he's only going to be doing this for about a year or so, but he's really in the limelight. And I think his timing was perfect for actually writing this book with Philip Mantle. I got those two together, and that was a big success. And he's going around the world and stuff. He's in a whirlwind because people are taking him seriously, and I think that's because things have changed in the UFO field. They're not just passing it off as a crazy guy, and he is. It is a very credible case. Good one. Mm-hmm.
I agree. Yeah, it is a very credible case, and they said that. And I'm not sure if this is the case, and as far as I know, it still is. It's after the Congress, after the UFO Congress, he's not going to be doing talks or anything anymore. He's going back to fishing.
That's what he says. Yeah, we'll see.
Full-time fishing.
Yep. That's even part of his email.
Out there in Mississippi.
Yeah.
But yeah, lots of other stories, of course, related to the Navy, talking about UFOs. Congress talking about UFOs, and the last week we've heard from a Senator Warren, who's part of the Intelligence Committee, him talking about being briefed on UFOs and why he thinks that this is serious and it needs to be taken seriously. And then, of course, the president has a little bit of a mention on ABC about all of this, which has also kind of created this media fervor, which is all still going on. So we have a lot of talk about UFOs. And even some sightings of loon balloons.
Oh yeah,
that have spawned some UFO sighting reports. But as the public gets more interested in this topic, they're also going to be more interested in these cases or these objects that often create these UFO reports that aren't UFOs. But that's going to happen. But still, we all get educated, and this doesn't account certainly for all of the Navy accounts or other serious accounts that we've heard across along the way over the years. So it's an exciting time. All eyes are on what we do, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Hey, our good friend Lee Spiegel contacted me, I think it was yesterday, and about this spike of methane on Mars. Have you read anything about that?
Well, it's not necessarily. Yeah, they see methane on Mars, and the latest rover is designed to detect methane on Mars, and it's in a location where there is a lot of methane. That is exciting in that it could indicate life, but I think that there's a lot of news in the astrobiological world as well. There are other indications of potential life in other areas, so I mean, it's certainly an area to keep an eye on, but it may indicate life. It's not anything definitive. There are other processes that create methane gas, but at least this is one of the kind of hallmarks that they're looking for. They were looking to see at what concentrations methane exists, and they see it in very low concentrations. What that means to them is that there's a necessity to keep looking for potential for life. But they also make the point that this could be leftover methane from methane that was from life before. However, methane does get dissolved by solar rays, so it can't have been that long ago. But these are all the factors that things that they think about. They can figure out how long would methane last on a planet, given the deterioration of methane. And these are some of the things that they're considering and looking at right now. But methane is another sign that there could be life on Mars today, just like we have microbes in our soil and in our rocks. That could be the case in Mars.
And you have also a headline on your website about that life could have existed much earlier on Mars than on the Earth, which is pretty interesting as well. That's another good article.
That's another new discovery that they're looking at. Did Mars have life a long time ago? We know now, and this used to be this used to be strange to think that Mars had water or has water. We do know there is water there. I think now they even suspect there's liquid water there. The surface of Mars is not conducive to liquid water, but it could be if water is seeping out from the ground, and there's indication there could be liquid water underground. Of course, that's important to life as we know it. And they're looking at the possibility, because you do see that the surface of Mars was manipulated by water, by massive amounts of water. And, as much as 10 years, maybe even a little longer than that, that was kind of a crazy idea that Mars once had water. Now it's a given that Mars had lots of water, like we do, rivers and streams and lakes and possibly oceans. Yeah. And so that maybe they had an abundance of life in the past, and it's just gone now, that the atmosphere is left and the conditions have changed.
Right. Magnetosphere gone and everything evaporate. I'm glad we're talking about Mars with the hat you're wearing. It worked perfectly.
Yeah, perfect timing. I didn't even know you were going to go there, but this is from my Mars television series. I got that from Nat Geo, and you guys should check that out because it's online streaming. But a great show where it considers a lot of these ideas, the science behind that, and behind us going to Mars. In fact, Brian Bender from Politico, who writes a lot about space and these sort of things and UFOs lately, he's in the show Unidentified. He predicted today on Twitter that we won't get to Mars till 2040. Why? This show covers a lot of it. There are a lot of considerations. So just because Elon Musk might be able to get us there in the next 10 years doesn't mean we're ready, nor does it mean that humans can survive.
Exactly.
There's a lot of stress on the human body. There's a lot we have to figure out still that we haven't. Radiation shielding, all of these sort of things, and we really haven't moved very far. So we've moved further on the propulsion area than we have on the actual habitation area. And that's probably what's going to stall us getting humans to Mars. Even though we may have a lot more as far as probes and maybe even humans orbiting Mars in the next 10 years or so, to actually stay there for a period of time, it's going to be a little more difficult.
Yeah, there's so many hazards. It's most likely a one-way trip is the best we could do at this, even in 10 years from now, probably.
Yeah. So Bender predicts even when we get there, if that is indeed 2040-ish, that it'll be a one-way trip and possibly even a suicide mission.
Yeah. There's so many hazards, like you say. What fun it will be to live underground, right?
Yeah, well, that would be one potential. Actually, Bob Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace just announced in the last week also a different system where essentially you take these fabric chutes, almost like these straws that are put together, and you fill them with regolith. And this is in the case of the moon. Essentially, you fill them with the material you find on the surface of the moon, and then you drape those over your habitats, and that protects you from radiation. So it's kind of a novel idea of how we can live on the surface. Yeah, because that's the main concern. Living underground is one way to avoid the radiation, but this is another way that could also be cost effective, fairly simple to do, and another realistic way that we could avoid the radiation.
Excellent. All right. Well, hey, thanks so much.
Yep, thank you.
All right, and we'll be talking to you again next week, as always. I appreciate it.
All right, have a great show.
You bet. All right, take care. All right, everyone. So we are ready to roll with Nick Redfern. He's been on the show many times. Like I said in the beginning, he's one of the favorites here. And this time he is going to be talking about his book called Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, UFOs, Russia Meddling, Soviet Spies and Cold War Secrets. He's a full-time author. I can't believe the amount of books this gentleman writes. He's always fun to talk to. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hey, Martin. How's it going?
It's going great. Good to have you back again.
Oh, thanks.
Yes. So, Nick, we don't have to go, because you've been on this show a number of times, we don't have to go into your background like we often do in the beginning of these shows here. But if you would, why don't you tell us the genesis of this book? What made you decide to write it?
Well, whenever I'm writing a new book, I always try and find, something that's new. You don't want to just go over old ground and recycle stuff. It's just pointless, And there are so many different aspects to the UFO phenomenon that, you can go in many different directions. Now, just to sort of, one of the things I talk about in the introduction of the book is how the theme of the book is how the Russians at the height of the Cold War, or throughout the Cold War, fabricated and created bogus UFO cases as a means to sort of psychologically sort of or at least trying to alter the mind, the state of mind of the U.S. public and the military. And it was sort of a very bizarre set of situations. Now, I should sort of state first that before we get to the issue of the Russians creating fabricated UFO cases, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there is a genuine UFO phenomenon. Now, I'm quite open as to whether it's extraterrestrial or if it's sort of interdimensional, multidimensional. I don't know. I'm honest enough to admit I don't know what the phenomenon is or where it's from and what its origins are. But I do believe there is a genuine UFO phenomenon which has nothing to do with, military experiments and things like that. Even though that's a part of it, there is a genuine UFO phenomenon. But what was particularly intriguing, and which a lot of people have overlooked, is the fact, is the fact that although there's a real phenomenon, that same real phenomenon at the height of the Cold War was sort of manipulated by Soviet intelligence as a means to create fake stories of UFOs, bogus tales of alien abductions and crashed UFOs, as a means to try and convince the United States that the aliens were communists. Now, as strange and as bizarre as that might sound, I actually managed to get a number of documents that actually confirmed that U.S. intelligence was deeply worried that if enough people read enough UFO books, like, for example, George Adamski's first book, wrote in its first print, sold 125,000 copies. And Adamski himself was a supporter of communism. A lot of people don't know that. And so there was deep concern that, this guy with communist leanings was selling books about aliens who were communists as well in the figures of 125,000. And the Russians sort of followed this angle more and more as a means to try and, from their perspective, destabilize the U.S. and have us think communism is actually quite a good thing. And so that's basically the theme of the book. As I point out, I'm a full-on believer in the phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon which intelligence agencies around the world have used and manipulated as a means to achieve a very different goal in many respects.
So is this more of like a Cold War thing that you're talking about? Because, you think about the modern day UFOs are, 1947 and after, post 1947. So it's all mostly the Cold War situation.
Well, most of it is, but it does go right to the present day. I mean, the title's Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, and the subtitle will give you sort of an idea of the theme. It's UFOs, Russian meddling, Soviet spies, and Cold War secrets. So a lot of it does cover the Cold War, but in saying that, it does actually take the subject right to the present day and demonstrates that at least as late as 2018 that this research was still being done by the Russians as a means to, again, manipulate the West. Now, one of the things I should stress is that, whoever's doing this, or the people who are doing this, primarily it's Russian intelligence. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate is that, for the most part, the people in the relevant countries, whether we're entirely friendly with them or not, they're just like us. They're normal, regular people, but all of us, the regular, normal people, are just caught up in this sort of mess of governments, sort of going head to head. Actually, ironically, I have several Russian friends here in the Russian area, and they're just like us. And of course, that might sound a stupid thing to say, but some people think, well, they're not, because they're Russians, but they are. They like to go out on a Friday night and have a couple of beers and hang out and have a good time.
Right.
But what it comes down to is that we're not the ones who are dictating the situation. That goes for the same for the people in any nation. The Russian people are no different to us. They're not demons. They don't want to destroy us. People in their government may want to destroy us, but they don't. Like us, they just want to be able to have a good life and not have to worry about mushroom clouds and radiation.
Right. And like you mentioned, you have some friends. Of course, I've been my girlfriend of many years is Russian, and there's a lot of them want to come here, because they feel it's a better life here than over there. And after spending, an equivalent of, I think, about a couple of months over there, I can see why it is much nicer here. I like being here.
My dad went to Russia about 30-something years ago on vacation and had a great time. Went to the Kremlin and St. Petersburg and Moscow and all over the place. And he had a really good time and took a bunch of photographs. And it was far more sort of severe then, as it was as it is today.
That's right.
But I think what all this kind of demonstrates is that, whether you're born in Russia or you're born in China or you're born wherever, we are really the pawns, and we can actually all sort of resonate with each other and hang out, provided we can talk to each other, with the respective languages. But it really is, the governments that screw everything up. Because like I said, the Russian people are no different to us. The Chinese, it's the people who pull the strings that to sort of end up demonizing everything.
Yeah. We have to go to break in about 1 minute or so here. So, and I want to get into specifics, but keeping the 1 minute in check right here. Do you want to? You want to start out by, what do you talk about at the very beginning of the book? How do you get...
Well, yeah, sure. Well, the book basically starts with U.S. intelligence when the whole flying saucer phenomenon began in the summer of 1947. They started to look into these cases and got significant rumors from the intelligence people that the Russians were working on... This is this is just almost post-Kenneth Arnold. We're trying to find ways to use this real phenomenon and spread stories that, yes, the phenomenon is extraterrestrial. Oh, and by the way, they're communists. So that was what really fired up U.S. intelligence to sort of hit back psychologically, when they heard that the Russians were trying to convince the U.S. people that, the phenomenon was communist in nature, and... wouldn't it be great to be a communist, How
about that? Wow. Okay, so we're going to head to break. All right, everyone, my guest tonight is Nick Redfern, and we will be right back right after these messages. Hang in there.
And we're clear, Martin, and we've got 3.5 minutes in this break.
Okay, I set the timer. Thank you. All right, Nick, so during the break here, we've got 3.5 minutes. And so just keep that in mind. I wanted to ask you, what number book is this of yours? Anyway.
Actually, I have to think about it myself. But it's 53, 54, 55. It's something like that. So
that's amazing.
It's thereabouts. It's the mid-50s.
Yeah. And no one that I know or have, no author I've ever spoken to in the past has your discipline. And for for the person that is unaware of how you write your books, can you just tell them you treat it like a job? It's fascinating.
Well, I treat it as a job in the sense that I am kind of sort of driven in the way I work, but I wouldn't want people to think it's just a job. It isn't. It's a passion and
of course. I didn't mean it like that.
Yeah. It's like a passion. It's exciting. It's fun to do it, and and uncovering information. So as long as I've got that energy and that sort of fascination and excitement for it, I'll keep doing it. But in terms of sort of how I structure the research and the writing, I like to do 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, and then I've got weekends off, I've got evenings off. I never work evenings, never work weekends. Laptop shuts down at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I don't touch it till 9 o'clock Monday morning. And
that's amazing.
But when Monday comes round, Monday morning, I do work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And you can get a lot done.
I'm sure.
Time, really.
I'm sure. As an, I don't really consider myself an artist. I'll say I'm a painter. But if I'm really into a painting, I can't put that down. How do you, like, if you're really on a roll, how do you stop at 4 o'clock or whatever it is, 5
well, that's
o'clock?
actually a good question. What I tend to do, if you've got sort of 6 or 7 things swirling around your mind for that particular chapter, and it's time to finish, what I generally do is to sort of get a sheet of paper and jot down what those 5 or 6 really cool extra things I need to do to make the chapter really good. So I'll sort of make like bullet points, and then next morning I've still got those bullet points in front of me and in my head as well. So I can pick up straight away. I don't feel that I've got to keep going because I'm on a roll. I wake up on a roll. So.
Well, I guess that I guess I would say that I have more of an obsessive nature, and when I get into something, I really like to get through it, and so I can't do what you do in your work, but I really admire it, and it's obvious it works very well.
Well, thank you. Well, I think any kind of work in the arts, whether it's poetry, painting, photography, music, whatever. I think, everybody, has their own angle, and I always have to say to people, anybody and everybody has at least one story in them that can be turned into a book, something that happened in your life.
I agree. We're right at our end of our break here, but I agree with that. I think everyone has a story.
We're ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready here.
Here we go.
Yep.
In 5, 4, 3, 2.
All right. Welcome back. My guest tonight is Nick Redfern. This is Martin Willis at Podcast UFO. And we were talking about, right before the break, we were talking about extraterrestrial and communism, the threat of spreading communism, which I think is fascinating. I can't believe that this was actually used as a tool. I had never heard of this before. Is this something, where did you first catch wind of this? Because I just never heard about this.
Well, over the years, I came across a few stories and snippets here and there as to sort of, how the Russians were manipulating the UFO subject. Now, the reason why most people, the general public, all of us, the main reason why we didn't know was because it was being done very, very sort of deeply and secretly behind the scenes. And so they sort of, almost like a silent war was going on between Russian intelligence and American intelligence. And the average person who might have been interested in the UFO subject wouldn't have known of that aspect of it. But I often use the Freedom of Information Act of a number of nations and managed to get hold of a lot of documentation showing there was deep concern, even in sort of the weeks and months after the Kenneth Arnold case in 1947, in June 24, 1947, which was the case more than any other that really gave birth to the flying saucer phenomenon. Now, through the Freedom of Information Act from the FBI, I got hold of a lot of documentation where the FBI came to believe that at least some UFO cases in the summer of 47, when it all kicked off, were actually not Russian spies, but shall we say people who were sort of either communists or were open to communism and were recruited by the Russians to spread fake UFO stories and to also spread the rumors that these were craft created by the Russians and that they were sort of far in advance of what we got. In other words, like a secret weapon, so to speak. And the FBI actually opened an entire file on these rumors, and they tried to track down who these people were in the United States who were sort of working on behalf of the Kremlin as a means to convince the U.S. Population that these strange things that everybody's seeing in the sky are coming from the Soviet Union, and they can outfly, and the technology is so advanced that here in the West we'd have nothing to combat them. Now, the reason why this didn't become sort of big news in terms of the media, but it did in U.S. intelligence, is because the U.S. took steps, and very understandably steps, as to why they should keep this quiet, because the last thing, we just got out the Second World War, and the Russians were becoming potentially the next big enemies or foes, if you like. And so they tried all their utmost to try and prevent the Russians from associating in the mind's eye of the U.S., to prevent them from creating a connection between UFOs and communism. But what I found, again, using the Freedom of Information Act, I got hold of George Adamski's FBI file. Now, George Adamski, for people who may not know, he was one of the earliest so-called contactees of the 1950s. Now, they were people who claimed to have had very close encounters with extremely human-looking aliens, typically in sort of desert locations, like in the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, California, and so on. And these so-called space brothers that the contactees met, they actually sort of spouted a lot of data, if you like, and ideas and concepts that were very much communist in nature. Now, initially, the FBI released about 75 to 80 pages of material, surveillance files on George Adamski. About 3 years ago, that figure got about 250 pages. By now, today, the FBI released about 450 pages of surveillance documents on George Adamski. And wow. most of the contactees were watched in that period by the FBI, and I've got most of their FBI files. Now, in Adamski's file, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, his first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, actually sold 125,000 books or thereabouts. Now, what happened was that Adamski was someone who, again, a lot of people don't know this, but he was someone who had a big affinity for communism. And on his lecture circuits, he would talk about how the Russians were going to dominate the world, and that it would only take a small number of atomic bombs to place the U.S. in a state of chaos. And you can understand at the height of the early Cold War and the Reds under the beds threats and everything, that kind of thing, you can easily understand why the FBI opened a file on George Adamski. But what was even more intriguing, one of the reasons why the file was opened was because on several occasions, Adamski was seen chatting at conferences and also in bars and restaurants in Los Angeles, actually talking with Russian people, apparently all about his his ability to sort of spread communism, but by doing it through like a flying saucer aspect, and that really worried the FBI. I mean, if you think about it, if Adamski's book only sold 25 books, and like on a Sunday afternoon, he would put a lecture on and 10 people would turn up, the FBI probably wouldn't bother about that at all.
Sure.
But here's a guy saying communism's great, and he's selling, 125,000 copies of his book, and his lectures were jammed. They were packed with people. And so the FBI was concerned, not so much about the UFO angle, but they were more concerned about how the UFO issue was being used to spread communism. And as I said, that doesn't take away the fact that there is, in my mind, a genuine UFO phenomenon, but that phenomenon in the early 50s was hijacked, if you like, by the Russians to spread the word that, aren't we living in a great world, and over in the US you're living in a terrible world. That was basically the heart of it.
Isn't that something? Now, do you think that they sort of courted the UFO field or the contactee field or movement because they thought those people were more gullible and more vulnerable to change? I mean, where do you think their reasoning was as far as targeting? Did they, as far as your research goes, was it any other type of paranormal situation as well, or just the flying saucer?
No, there actually were other ones, and I'll talk about a couple of interesting ones. But just quickly, when you mentioned, about who gets targeted and why and so on, the interesting thing about George Adamski is that before he was actually targeted by either Russian intelligence or by people in the United States who, were into communism but were U.S. citizens, basically what happened was that they targeted first people who the Russians did background checks on people like Adamski, and they basically targeted those people first because they would be the most vulnerable. So a lot of background on the part of the Russians went on to try and figure out who can we use to best achieve this particular goal. But in terms of other programs as well, which it's not a UFO program, but it does involve sort of a paranormal phenomenon in the sky, and it relates again to the Cold War in the early 1960s when Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba. Now, because Cuba was so close to the U.S. and still is, obviously,
90 miles,
and and there was concern about the Russians having sort of satellite bases and things like this on on Cuba itself. Now, there was a guy named Major Edward Lansdale, and he came up with some very weird plans and projects as to how to try and destabilize the government of Fidel Castro. And one of the ideas that Lansdale came up with, and I swear I'm not making this up, but he had this plan where aircraft would be flown into the clouds over Cuba, and they would have these powerful microphones which would blast down to the ground voices saying basically saying this is the voice of Jesus. You need to sort of overthrow Castro and embrace the world of the West. And to try and achieve that, the other part of the project was to try and project huge images of Jesus onto clouds. And so you'd have the alleged voice of Jesus, and you would have the projection of Jesus projected onto the clouds as a means to sort of convince the people of Cuba that a second coming was on the horizon, and you better come over to our side and you better do something about Fidel Castro. Now, the program was actually dropped because it was seen as just too complicated and too technical to allow it to go ahead. But this plan to sort of project not so much holograms but images onto the clouds and to blast the so-called voice of Jesus, that was the plan, and it was going to go ahead. But as I said, there were so many ifs and buts, and in the end they dropped the program. But that was sort of one of the really alternative programs, which, as I said, it wasn't a UFO program, but it did involve, like a supernatural image in the sky. And had it worked, I mean, who knows what history would it have changed it,
That's right. Wow. So interesting. As far as when they're the contactee movement here. Was there anything at all like that in Russia? Did they have any people that claimed that they were contactees over there? Did you find any of that?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer to that question is actually no. There weren't really, in the 40s and 50s, hardly anybody in the contactee movement in Russia at that time that was really, sort of high profile or was being manipulated by the intelligence services. It was primarily in the United States, the UK, and Australia. Now, one of the more intriguing cases involves a guy named Orfeo Angelucci, and he was sort of the second level of the contactees in the 50s. When it all kicked off, and we had the flying saucer phenomenon began in 47 with Kenneth Arnold. Then it was sort of around about 51 when people started to claim they'd seen these very human-looking aliens known as the Space Brothers. And without doubt, whether you believe his stories or not, George Adamski was sort of the ultimate contactee. But then you had sort of like the second level, like George Van Tassel, and then you had Orfeo Angelucci, excuse me, and various other ones. Now, the most interesting story is one of Orfeo Angelucci, and he was someone who claimed to have had close encounters late at night in Los Angeles in the early 1950s. And again, the typical conversation revolved around how we should get rid of our nuclear weapons and all live together, otherwise the world's going to be destroyed, and so on. And Angelucci was sort of quite inspired by these claimed encounters to go out there and sort of spread the word as to we all need to live together and the Russians aren't so bad after all. And again, kind of like Adamski, he got a very large following. What's particularly intriguing, though, is that by his own admission, on one occasion in the 1950s, Angelucci was essentially drugged by sort of like a mind-altering drug in the early 1950s, and as he wrote the story up himself, he was interrogated by what he came to believe was somebody in U.S. intelligence who wanted to know who these people in Russian intelligence were that had approached him and who had sort of pushed him to promote the communist angle in his lectures and in his books. They wanted him to talk about communism in his lectures. They wanted to write about communism in relation to aliens in his books. And American intelligence wanted to know who it was that had hired him to do this. Now, it turned out that Angelucci actually hadn't been recruited, although American intelligence thought he had been. But he actually fought against it. He was not a communist at all, but he didn't stop the Russians from sort of clandestinely saying, hey, Orfeo, you start talking about the communist side of why, of the aliens and so on, we'll make it financially worth your time to do so. And to his credit, he backed away and said not just no, but hell no. And an extensive file was opened on him, but the FBI realized that he was really, he wasn't sort of a guilty person. He was someone caught up in this strange scenario where the Russians had approached him and wanted him to promote communism from an alien perspective. And so, it was a very odd period. This is still sort of 1950s, mid to late 1950s, when people like Adamski and Angelucci were being closely watched by the FBI, and equally they were they were being pushed by the Russians to try and influence the U.S. the population into thinking that, oh my God, communism is the way of the future and it's extraterrestrial. Today, looking back, it sounds really bizarre and weird. But from the Russians' perspective, the idea was that we really can alter the mindset of the population. And the U.S. intelligence was sort of, quite understandably, trying to find a way to completely obliterate this particular program. And the concern they had was that the UFO subject has a huge following. It always has. Mm-hmm. But back in the 50s, a lot of those books, they sold six figures, regularly. And so what we today might think, well, that's like really weird, trying to make the other side think that aliens are communists. But back then, it really was seen as like a viable tool, if you like, to really scare the US and the UK and Australia into thinking that, yes, there's a real UFO phenomenon, but it's not on your side, and it was really just all about sort of psychologically playing with the mindsets of the potential enemy,
Yeah. With the amount, I was just thinking of something kind of funny, with the amount of times that we've been talking about communism and communists today, and we're using Skype over phone and all that. The NSA is probably listening.
Well, hopefully I'm helping them to, demonstrate what's been going on,
Yeah. It's I do have to say, spending as much time in Russia as I have, I did speak to a number of people. Some people over there are some that speak English that I was able to communicate with. I don't know any Russian. I can just barely get by. But anyway, I was surprised at how many people I got into conversations and talked about communism that actually liked communism. They, I mean, it's such a bad word here. It's almost like, the word communist and communism makes people shake in their boots. But these people that I spoke to over there said, hey, the food was better, and we weren't there weren't people starving and like there is now, and so I'm sure there are good points, but obviously it doesn't work. It didn't work there anyway. It's still ongoing in China.
And I think we can learn a lot from sort of each other's cultures. I mean, for example, you can obviously tell from my voice. I'm originally from England. And I grew up in England as a kid and teenager and through my 20s before I moved over here. But I mean, for example, the British medical insurance, is very different to over here. And I often see in the US that people refer to the UK's medical service as socialized medicine or socialized insurance. And just that word socialized, puts raises the hairs on the back of people. And it makes it sound like, we're all a bunch of sort of red flag waving commies, It's not like that at all. Yes, the medical insurance program in the UK is very different to in the US, but it's not socialized medicine, which sounds just like something that crawled out of the Kremlin. It's not. And so we can all sort of learn, I think, from each other. Now, I mean, communism does not work. And I think an enterprising economy and encouraging people, to get out there and achieve things in lives, not just personally, but also economically as well. I think that's a very good thing,
Yeah. And then another thing that really grew was the black market. When there's communism, there was people still making money, but not in a legal way, and that's what. There's a lot of things that grow out of that. And capitalism, is not fault free either. We have the 1% elite and all that, making more money than, CEOs making 300 times what a worker makes that actually works on the product. So there is a lot of things that could be tweaked, that's for sure.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I mentioned how, I've got several friends who are Russians. Well, I've also got several friends who actually happen to be Russian strippers, and they make a huge amount of money.
Yeah,
they've embraced capitalism with a capital C.
Yeah. Well, and, it's an interesting culture, and money is very important. Money is, and it's because lack of, growing up in the atmosphere of lack of. So money and material is very important to the culture. I've seen that for sure.
Yeah, and I think what's important, when it comes to this issue of sort of Russian manipulation of the UFO subject, it's very easy to actually manipulate people on a large scale. It doesn't take long for the sort of the whole mindset to sort of get in line when there's a threat or something. It's kind of like the issue of when you go to the airport, you take your shoes off. Well, that was revolved around one person who had that potential bomb and issue, which actually didn't work. And yet everybody goes to the airport and without thinking takes their shoes off. In other words, when something happens, we subconsciously or unconsciously get in line with it, and that's a perfect example of it. And I think that's what the Russians were hoping for. They were hoping for an assumption that would become accepted that the aliens are here and they're on the side of the Russians. And that's why you had things like the CIA's Robertson panel, which was created in the 50s to actually try and prevent that scenario from occurring. That the Robertson panel was this this panel created in the late 50s, but which really came to the fore in 1953. And the CIA realized that if they didn't sort of intervene, that more and more of these bogus stories about, extraterrestrial communists and so on, if they didn't stop it, that more and more people would buy into the hysteria, but without thinking about it, kind of, again, like, when you go to the airport, you just take your shoes off without thinking. And so the CIA came up with all sorts of plots as a means to try and destabilize the Russians' UFO program. And I talk about that in the book, where U.S. intelligence created fake stories of crashed UFOs. They basically created fake stories saying that U.S. intelligence had got crashed UFO materials and debris and alien technology, and they subtly seeded that story into Russian intelligence to make it look like it had been stolen, the data had been stolen from the U.S., and in reality, the U.S. intelligence had actually created these stories to try and frighten the Kremlin, the Russian premiers and so on, to try and convince them that, the U.S. government had got alien technology, highly advanced technology. And so, the plan was to try and frighten the Russians into thinking, we'd got highly advanced weaponry that they hadn't got. So it became almost like a really weird game almost, between the two to try and, so who could sort of best the other,
Isn't that something? So we are going into break here in about 1 minute or so. So do you think that there's any UFO stories that either side, either Russian or American, are out there that can be debunked as a one of these cases where they were trying to influence something that is standing that you're aware of? People call it like a UFO incident that never was.
Yeah, a perfect example is an alleged UFO crash in the island of Spitsbergen, just off the coast of Norway, in the early 1950s. And it's sort of like, I guess it's like Norway's version of Roswell. It's a story of a crashed UFO. Now, if you go to the National Security Agency, the NSA's website, and go to their UFO section, and they put some of their files on UFOs on their website, there's actually a section about this crashed UFO story. Now, somebody at the NSA has circled the section on the Spitsbergen case, and in big capital letters, they've written the word plant. Now, as I talk about this in the book, and I point out that we could be looking at the NSA having created and fabricated this Spitsbergen story of a crashed UFO, or the NSA found out it was a Russian plant. We just don't know which is the truth. But we've got the documents showing that the NSA were clear on the fact that this Spitsbergen crashed UFO story of the early 50s was a plant. Now, this was clearly either created by U.S. intelligence to think the Russians, make the Russians think that we got highly advanced alien technology, or it was the other way around. But that story, to get back to your question, that story, the Spitsbergen UFO case, is still sort of championed to this day, 70 years almost after it allegedly occurred. And a lot of people in ufology still believe that is a legitimate case. Now, maybe it is, but when you see official documents referring to it as a plant, then you actually have to wonder, was this a Russian program, or was it an American response to the Russian program?
Fascinating. Okay, we're going into the break. This is Martin Willis with Podcast UFO. My guest is Nick Redfern, and we'll be right back in just a couple of minutes. That's it. All right, welcome back. This is Martin Willis, and my guest tonight is Nick Redfern. And we were talking just before the break about the Pittsburgh, I think that's what you called it, the crash UFO case, and how that was probably just a formulated thing to actually manipulate. It was the U.S. You actually recovered the document through a FOIA, did you? Or how did that happen?
Yes, I got it through the Freedom of Information Act, and actually the FBI have now placed it on its own its official website. If you go to I think it's nsa.gov, but if it isn't, if you just type in National Security Agency, you'll find their official site, and on that site there are a number of the files that they've released through the Freedom of Information Act, which admittedly isn't a gigantic amount, but they do have a UFO section. Now, one of those particular documents in the UFO section of the NSA files, you have this document talking about an alleged UFO crash in the early 1950s, 1952 actually, in a little island called Spitsbergen off the coast of Norway. And somebody in the NSA, we don't know because the person didn't leave their name, but they've circled that particular story with a pen or a marker, and then next to it in capital letters they've written plant. So, as I point out in the book, there's two possibilities. Either this was a planted story by the US to try and convince the Russians that we'd found highly advanced alien technology on the island of Spitsbergen, or it was the exact opposite, that it was a planted story by the Russians to try and convince us that the Russians had got alien technology. But what's intriguing, and this sort of gets to the heart of the book, is that these stories were so sort of persuasive that even to this day, almost 70 years later, which was like 68 years, 67 years later, people still, talk about the Spitsbergen UFO case, and that sort of demonstrates the allure and the strength that these stories still have,
Really? Well, Nick, I just want to let you know I just posted the call-in number up on the site.
Okay.
Because I think that we might get a few calls tonight, so we might as well start taking them early. So basically just to let the listener out there know, if you're calling in, please mute your program that you're listening to when you call in, and I'm going to put you on hold basically until I announce you. You'll just be waiting, and you'll hear the show live. It's a little different, about 30 seconds off from what you hear live. There's a difference of about that. So the other thing I was thinking about, Nick, there's been over the years, there's really unique and famous Russian cases, and I tried to do some research when I was there. Is that anything that you crossed research while you were looking into this, like some of the UFO events and really crazy encounters in Russia? That's a large landmass. That's
Well, actually, that's a good point, because this is where things kind of get murky, but on both sides, the West and the East. I think if you look at the issue of the Russians creating and fabricating UFO stories as a means to promote communism in the West and so on at the height of the Cold War, inevitably it sort of causes you to wonder, well, how many of these stories that we think are real were actually part of this disinformation psychological warfare program, and how many were the real thing. And I think that's an important thing. It sort of opens like a Pandora's box,
Mm-hmm.
It's like, which are the real ones and which are the bogus ones, put together for a different angle. Now, I guess my answer to that question is, because a lot of the cases from the 50s and 60s where Russia was an extremely closed country, it's very difficult to say which cases were genuine and which were not. But to sort of go back to the beginning, the most important thing is that we recognize that this issue of using the UFO subject was born out of the fact that both sides, the Russians and the Americans, realized that there was a genuine phenomenon, and that's an important thing. It doesn't matter, if the Russians and in return the US were fabricating UFO stories to try and beat the other side psychologically, but the fact still exists that there is a phenomenon. I mean, to sort of just quickly go aside, the reason why I got involved in the UFO subject wasn't because I had my own encounter, but my dad was a radar mechanic in the British Royal Air Force, and he was involved in several UFO incidents, which was still at the height of the Cold War, where strange, high-flying craft were approaching the UK land, the side of the country, the east side of the country, and basically nobody knew what this phenomenon was. The first thought was it's got to be the Russians, but these objects were flying at extraordinary speeds and heights, and even performing, like for example, hovering at 20,000 feet. This went on for 3 nights, and fighter planes were sent up to intercept them, and the pilots reported seeing these, in some cases, like classic 1950s flying saucer type craft, in other cases, like bright lights. And at the end of these encounters, everybody, like the pilots, the ground crew, the radar operators, and people like my dad, the radar mechanics, were all taken into a room and told, you won't talk about this, this is national security. And my dad didn't tell me till I was about 12. So there's no doubt that there's a real phenomenon. But the tricky issue, if you like, or the question, to go back to your question, when it comes to these Russian cases, how do we know which ones were the real cases and how many were, the ones used as a means to try and, provoke the idea that aliens are really commies. Now, when you put it like that, it's difficult to give an answer, but I mean, certainly I'm sure that a number of cases in Russia are genuine in the same way that they are elsewhere. I'm sure there's been hundreds, maybe even thousands of genuine Russian incidents. But, when you've got the Kremlin thinking, wow, we can do something with this, then it really does become hazy as to, where the lines are blurred.
Right. I wonder when the use of radar began in the military. I just did a quick search on that, trying to figure out exactly, because I'm wondering if radar was used, prior to way back.
Well, radar was used in the Second World War. That's when it was sort of developed. But it's 50s and 60s onwards was when it really kind of took off, because there was this, in the post-Second World War era, everything changed, because up until then, it would be, all the battles, all the wars were fought by soldiers, with tanks, with guns, with rifles, with grenades. And the early 50s, everything changed when every nation on the planet could be wiped out, by atomic weapons. And, and it was like a totally different world. And so that was the main reason for, creating high-powered, highly advanced radar, because it would at least give us some sort of indication of what's coming over on the horizon. Not that it would, for the most part, you'd be able to prevent it, but at least you'd know what was happening. So, in the Cold War from the early 50s onwards, understanding and detecting, sort of Russian bombers coming over the horizon or whatever, that was vital, because it wasn't just a case of trying to blow them out the sky. They're carrying atomic bombs which could wipe out a city and vaporize, the entire population of a U.S. city.
That's right. That's right. And, it just seems to me, I'm sure you've probably seen a little bit on the news here and there, and there's also, if anyone's watching the series on the History Channel, Unidentified, you'll see that there's more technology that we have. With the more technology that we have, it seems like we're having more military sightings, and I think, technology is only going to grow as far as, the different spectrums and all that we actually are able to detect. But now, seems more than ever that we're seeing a lot more. And, that's kind of what the question was leading up to about radar.
Well,
Well,
that's an interesting question or an interesting issue, because when you look at the UFO phenomenon, particularly today, there's a lot of UFO activity going on. The government's sort of starting to release information here and there, and it's all occurring at the same time when the world's in pretty much a very dangerous state. And, so you've got, on the one side, you have people who think that, well, there's more and more UFO encounters because they're getting prepared to prevent us from, destroying the entire planet or whatever, which is one intriguing theory, and the other theory, of course, is that, well, are these actually real UFOs, or are they highly advanced technologies of the military, of whichever nation? Or maybe it's a combination of the two. For the most part, the UFO phenomenon kind of doesn't, we've never had kind of that the day the Earth stood still scenario, where a UFO lands and we're told, you either lay down your nukes or we'll do it for you. That's never happened, but it could happen. It could happen, and I think it's important to note that. But it's also to note that the more and more that our technology develops, the more and more difficult it becomes to differentiate between a real UFO and something that might be, just coming off the, the plant where something really strange has been developed, and people assume it's a UFO in terms of it being an alien spaceship. So I think in today's world, there's two things going on. There are highly advanced technologies of various militaries around the world, and there still is a genuine UFO phenomenon that nobody, I think even in government, probably doesn't really have a handle on what they are or where they're from.
I agree. I've said that a number of times on the show. We're taking call-ins. If anyone wants to give us a ring, ask Nick a question. That number is 603-967-4030. Getting back to the theme of your book, did they ever have any measurable success in converting people to communism? Anything that was ever documented in any of the research you looked at?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is an organization that some of your listeners may have heard of. It's not sort of as high profile as it was in the 50s and 60s, but it was called the Aetherius Society. Now, the Aetherius Society have it was actually an English group, but their headquarters now is in Los Angeles. And they were sort of like a group for contactees and for people who'd had close encounters. And it was very much sort of bordered upon like a religion almost. Now, according to the Aetherius Society, many of the members had actually had sort of face-to-face with very human-looking aliens. And in some cases, there was this issue of how we need to sort of turn towards communism and so on. Now, in the late 1950s, an arm of the British police force called Special Branch, which was like the intelligence division of the British police force, opened a file on the Aetherius Society secretly. And we know that because the file has now been declassified into the public domain. But back in the late 50s, members of the Aetherius Society would go out into the streets of London and talk about how we need to get rid of our atomic weapons and live alongside the Russians in a friendly way, and so on. Now, kind of like with George Adamski, Special Branch probably wouldn't have bothered if the group was just 3 or 4 people, but it wasn't. It was actually sort of quite a high-profile organization which was saying, we need to drop our atomic weapons and so on. So Special Branch would clandestinely sit in the audiences at their conferences and lectures. And again, we know that through the files, which have been officially declassified, which sort of begs the question, how many conferences today, have people sitting in the audience who are just there, to collect data for the government? I think, it's probably going on all the time. But I was able to get a hold of the Atheria Society file put together by Special Branch, the British police force, and that particular file runs to about 70 pages, and it talks about how they sat in the audience and how, there was a lot of debate at the lectures and the conferences about should we get rid of our nukes and so on. What's particularly notable is that after the Atheria Society sort of bought into this angle of, getting rid of our nukes, many of the people who were members of the Atheria Society took part in protest matches in the 50s and 60s, essentially telling the UK people that, hey, we need to get rid of our nukes. And many of the Atheria Society peoples went on these marches, and they got a lot of feedback and coverage. So, this is a perfect example, another example, but outside of the US, but in the UK, obviously, we're the UK and the US are friends, and we work together, on intelligence and national security issues, which is good. But during that period, the Atheria Society were perceived by British intelligence as potential threats because of their lectures, their conferences, and talking about, the UK needs to sort of back away from all this, and what the Russians and Americans want to do is their business, but we need to stay out of it. And so that's why a file was opened on them, And so in that sense, that program did work, in the sense that you had this group that really was sort of saying, that one of our agendas is to try and, get rid of nukes. So that did work,
Wow, that is something. Now, what part of the Russian government was involved in this in particular? Was the KGB part of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was the KGB at the height of the Cold War. Now, although obviously Russia still has an intelligence agency, the KGB by that name doesn't actually exist anymore. But basically, it was exactly the same. In the US, you got the FBI, which handles intelligence issues domestically within the United States, and the CIA is responsible for operating outside of the US in terms of intelligence, and the NSA are sort of the eavesdroppers. They sort of do all the spying, or they used to, and they still do that today, but a lot of it now is sort of focusing on social media like Twitter and Facebook, and just picking information out like that. And certainly in the height of the Cold War with the KGB, I mean, they were the primary ones who were working to put these programs together, and this involved things like what's known as psychological warfare, where you create fake stories and you seed them into the world of the enemy, so to speak, and the enemy doesn't realize they're being fed bogus tales. And you also have disinformation, where, for example, genuine material is kind of manipulated and altered, so nobody really knows what the real picture is. And people who work in the field of disinformation are very good, very skilled at creating fake stories that look to be the real thing. So it was, like I said earlier, it was sort of like a strange, quiet, hidden war between the intelligence sources in Russia, primarily the KGB, and in the US, the CIA, FBI, an NSA, and it really was kind of like a what you call like an upmanship situation where, how can we trump the other side, and how can the other one trump the other side, and come up with the wildest story that'll really worry, the people in the Kremlin, or it'll worry people in the Pentagon, So it was going on all the time, But the UFO program was one of many. I mean, just to sort of go off track a little bit, one of the things I talk about was some of the earlier other bizarre programs that the KGB came up with as a means to try and to sort of worry and sort of create anxiety within the U.S. government. One of these stories, which was totally fabricated, was that KGB agents spread rumors to U.S. intelligence that a number of atomic bombs, this is in the early 50s, a number of atomic bombs had been smuggled into the U.S., somewhere in the region of like 9 or 10 atomic bombs, and they'd been hidden in various U.S. cities like New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and so on as Las Vegas, Dallas, and so on. And the FBI was sort of quite understandably pretty much terrified, the idea that major cities in the United States had, really powerful atomic bombs just ready to be primed and detonated, and you millions and millions killed, and the atmosphere just filled with radiation. Now, it turned out that after 4 or 5 months of looking into this, the FBI realized that this story was totally bogus, that there were no atomic bombs have been smuggled into the United States at all by the Russians. But the Russians, successfully for a while, really did sort of have the FBI, their heads spinning with fear that how can we find these bombs? How can we prevent them from being detonated? And there was nothing to it. But the whole point was to just create fear by creating a highly sophisticated, bogus story. And that was, that sort of paralleled what was going on with the UFO angle, was to come up with really bizarre and sort of sinister stories and plant them and seed them in American intelligence, and have American intelligence running around like headless chickens trying to, find out what was going on, when actually nothing was going on. It was just the work of, these people who are very, very good at creating stories that actually have no validity to them.
Interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard of, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, the Verona's UFO incident in 1989, when the children in the park. Yeah, that's a fascinating one. I don't know. That can't possibly be one of those stories.
No,
those
you're
fake
right.
stories.
And I actually think that is a genuine, good, solid case. It's basically, in simple terms, like a UFO landing and entities coming out and multiple witnesses. Kind of cases we don't really get too much of today, but we did in the sort of the 50s and 60s and 70s. But that case, that I fully believe is a genuine Russian UFO case. But in saying that, it wouldn't surprise me if, there were people in the intelligence services in Russia who thought, well, maybe, okay, we don't know what happened. It looks like it was one of those genuine cases, but can we actually manipulate that real case as a means to, just screw up the Americans, for a couple of weeks or whatever? So I think both sides recognized, well, I know for sure both sides were driven by the fact that they both knew there were and are real UFOs, but that doesn't stop them and has never stopped them from finding ways to kind of scare and create paranoia in the people whose job it is to keep us safe,
Yeah, that is the one. I think it was a real tall robot that looked like a robot type figure came out, and like a
tall humanoid jerky type figure. Yeah, and if you read the whole story about it, it's a really interesting story, and as I said, it's sort of it's up there with a lot of these classic cases from the 50s and 60s where people are, driving home late at night and they see a UFO landing, or during the day. Kind of a good example would, like a similar one in the US, would be the Lonnie Zamora UFO landing in 1964. I mean, although that was only one witness, although there actually were several others from different locations, although that has one primary witness, I mean, it actually is not dissimilar, to the 1989 one in Russia. So in that sense, the case alone, regardless of any manipulation and changes and disinformation added to it later on, I think the fact is that is a legitimate example of something from somewhere else coming here, and us really not having any great understanding of what it was or even what it still is now, I guess.
Right. Speaking of that case, Ray Stanford wrote the best book on that. It's called Socorro Saucer. Well, Socorro, and then Saucer in a Pentagon Pantry. Very, very good book. Even Lonnie Zamora told his daughter, like, if you want to know about that incident, that is the book to read. And actually, Ray is listening. I'll encourage him to. He listens to the show quite often.
Cool.
Encouraging him to call in, actually.
What I would say, not just because Ray might be listening, but I mean, if you look at it, what's interesting, you look at books like Roswell, there have been dozens and dozens of books written on Roswell or Area 51 and alien abductions. The number of books that have been written on the whole Socorro story is extremely small. And even though Ray's book, is quite old now, I mean, I would still say that is the definitive book. If you want to find something about the Socorro case, don't bother going around the net or looking for this or looking for that. Just go to Ray's book. Go to his book, and because he wrote the definitive book, which still remains the definitive book on that particular affair.
That's right. Yeah. It's amazing if you think about. Actually, Ray just emailed me. So hopefully he'll call in. Hopefully he's listening, and he'll call in. And he wants to talk about the contactee movement because he was interested in that, and he was a young. I'll let him tell the story if he calls in, but
that's right. Yeah,
he was really young with this twin brother. That's right. As a kid, he was involved in the whole contactee issue, and a sort of fascinating era that I didn't, I wasn't around then, but that whole era, the contactees, the Space Brothers, it's a fascinating era, and those contactees, they were almost like the rock stars of their days, apart from the long hair and the spandex, Yeah, I know. It's fascinating. It would be a fascinating thing to study, the whole contactee movement. I mean, that would be a book worth writing, on that whole situation.
Well, funnily enough, a couple of friends of mine actually wrote a book about it just recently, and it's called A is for Adamski, and it's like an A to Z book of all the contactees. Yeah. And it's written by Greg Bishop and Adam Go-Rightly.
Oh.
It came out about 3 months ago, and that's like a really good, like a resource type book on all the various contactees, quite literally from A to Z.
How about that? I want to tell you, I had someone write me that's a family member of one of the major contactees, and I'm looking for it right now, the email, but he basically wrote me about them, someone starting a movie about the whole movement, and basically based on his. I don't think it was Adamski. It was one of. It was who was the one at the Giant Rock?
Oh, George Van Tassel.
I guess it was George Van Tassel's relative, but anyway, we got in a little bit of a heated debate, just because I said it was kind of calling out the theater of the whole situation, and he did not want to hear any part of that. So there's some people really hanging on to that whole movement even now, thinking that people were living on Venus and all that. It's interesting.
Well, my view on all this is that, I actually think debate and good debate and heated debate is actually a good thing, because at the end of the day, we know there is a UFO phenomenon, but we actually really don't have the answers to what's going on. So I think it's important that even if we have different angles and different views on this case or that case, or on the nature of the phenomenon, or whether they're extraterrestrial or interdimensional, or are they time travelers, I don't think it matters if it gets heated, as long as we try and make some advances by trying to figure out what's going on. I think that's actually a good thing, and it doesn't matter if it gets heated and almost where people are being pulled apart, pull him away, before he breaks somebody's jaw, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there's nothing wrong at all with a good, strong, solid, controversial debate. That I think actually we need more. I think very often in ufology, there's this angle to sort of toe the line and not, let's not sort of argue with each other and, and for me that's wrong. I mean, we don't really know what the answers are. We need to look for them. And if somebody doesn't like it, well, let's debate it and let's get a good argument going, because that's the best way to get answers, rather than just, going along with the whatever for the sake of it,
Well, since we're on this topic, there's quite a debate going on out there right now on whether there's one side saying that Lou Elizondo is not is not legit, and there's quite a debate going on out there, and along with TTSA and all that. There's it's kind of a battle and infighting, I guess you would call it, a little bit.
Well, it is, but I mean, there's several really interesting aspects to this. One is, what's going on quite literally right now. When I say literally right now, I mean like days and weeks around us right now. A lot of stories coming out, where more and more is coming out from the government side of things, from the Tom DeLonge side as well, but also. I think one of the things that I think often gets looked over when it comes to, just 2 years ago when the revelation was, the government's got this secret UFO program. I think one of the most important things that often gets looked over is the fact that, the debunkers and the skeptics basically said, the government doesn't have any information on UFOs because the government can't keep secrets. Well, the fact is, when at the end of 2017, December 2017, when that story broke about the U.S. government's UFO program, what that demonstrated was that the U.S. government actually did have an ongoing UFO program after all. And guess what? Nobody at all, apart from those involved, knew anything about it. So that actually does prove that the U.S. government can hide UFO secrets from us, and not only can they, but they did. And had that program not been sort of outed in the New York Times, we would not have known a single thing about it. So I think that's an important issue in what's going on right now, when people are looking for information and talking about this and talking about that. For me, the most important thing is it demonstrates that this UFO program was hidden and was never found or never discussed outside, the parameters of the program. And that sort of brings another issue to mind. How many other UFO programs are there, doing different research in different areas? How many other UFO programs are there, just like that one that was exposed in 2017? How many others are there still going on now that we don't know about? There could be another 5 or 10. There could be one investigating alien abductions. There could be a program investigating crop circles. You know what I mean? There could be so many different programs going on that nobody really knows about, apart from those that run the programs. And that was a perfect example of that, is what happened at the end of 2017 when we learned that there was this project and nobody knew about it at all.
That's right, and there is speculation, just what you're saying about that. I've heard. I think that question may have even been asked of Lou Elizondo himself about how many programs is it possible. It seems to me I heard something about that. We do have a question. Someone wants to know what you think about the narrow window into disclosure. The Pentagon videos reveal why such truncated and limited data. Doesn't it feel like a manipulation times 10? Interesting question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the things that sort of made me think about all this is, I mean, I've heard various theories as to what, the footage, the pictures actually show, and I've heard from various people, well, it's alien craft or it's some sort of highly advanced technology of the military. But one of the things, this is sort of more of not so much of something I can prove, but it's almost like a hunch. I kind of get the feeling that at least some of this footage, the film and the discussion of it and all of this is actually being sort of shown to us for a reason, And I think that's an important aspect to note. I think, I don't think this is just about trying to understand what's in the film. I think it's a case of subtly sort of letting the public know that, well, that there is something out there. And maybe, the next week and the next week we'll be shown something else. Now, does that mean we're sort of on the verge of full-scale, an exposure of everything? I don't know. That's sort of really difficult to say. But I think the footage, the film, the objects and so on, I think the agenda is to get the general public aware. Now and then, of course, the big question is, well, why does somebody want us aware? And of course, that's the big question, I think.
I think we have Ray calling in now, actually. Hey, Ray, is that you?
That's me.
Hey, Ray, welcome to the show. You're on with Nick Redfern. This is Ray Stanford.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey,
Hi.
Ray.
Hi, Nick. By the way, I want to thank both Martin and you for your nice comments on my Socorro book. But I was so pleased that you're bringing into the picture the FBI involvement back in the contactee days.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was in my teens back at that time, and while in my teens, I wrote with my twin brother a book in which we had some wonderful encounters with these objects, but we went overboard in our belief in Adamski and interpreted it in a very contactee context. So we kind of became known as contactees too. Well, it turns out the FBI was very interested in us, and I want to try to talk very fast because I've got a lot of interesting things to tell that happened to us in that context. But we decided to take a trip to Peru in 1957, January, and their travel agent had called us and said, "Look, you should know that somebody's concerned about this and checking into it." But he didn't want to tell us what it was. Okay, when we got on the plane and we had three different changes of plane on the way down to there, the same man in a blue suit with a tie got on the plane, and every time we changed planes, whether it was in Miami or whether it was in Havana, Cuba, we didn't change there, but we did stop there, or whether it was in Central America, in Panama, when we finally got down to Peru, this fellow in the blue suit stopped into the very same hotel, which was a expensive tourist hotel downtown across from the Plaza San Martin, and checked in right with us and checked in a room right beside ours. Well, we thought that was kind of interesting, and but we decided to get into a less expensive hotel, and we moved across town to a nice hotel, but not the tourist type, that was called Hotel 28 de Julio, their Independence Day, July 28th. And what we didn't know is that across the street from the hotel was the prison. Well, we were naive there. We had nothing to do with communism. In fact, it's well known that my brother and a friend of his in high school had started the Youth McCarthy Club just in the year before in high school. They were very anti-communist. But we began to suspicion this fellow in the not black suit but blue suit was kind of following us around. After all, how does he switch from the one hotel downtown and he switched into the 28 de Julio when we switched, and he was next door to us. He never spoke to us. So now here's the crazy part. one morning we decided to punch up the elevator and go down, and we were teetotalers, of course, but we wanted some orange juice for breakfast, and we punched the button to go down. The door opens up. You'd never guess who's standing in front of us. Not the man in blue. It was Raul Castro. Believe it or not. And John spoke pretty good Spanish, and he said, "Oh, Raul, ¿cómo está?" And Raul told us that he was there because across the street from the hotel was the prison. And he said, "I'm going there to solicit people who are just getting out of prison to come fight in La Revolucion." So this was amazing. Now here the FBI agent is next door to us, watching us, and he probably didn't even know that right in the same hotel, and we're talking to him in the elevator, was Raul Castro. It was really quite ironic.
Amazing.
But anyway, to make a long story short, when we finally managed to survive near death once and got back to good old hometown of Corpus Christi, Texas, my mother said, "Oh, gosh, I was so concerned about you." She said one day 2 FBI just came to the door. And they said, "Mrs. Stanford, we need to talk to you. We're concerned that your 2 twin sons are maybe communist. We suspect that why else would they go to Peru? No consideration of other reasons we might have." And she said, "Look, that's ridiculous." She said, "Don't you know about their involvement at Rex? At least attended and in fact participated in founding the Youth for McCarthy Club." She said, "You know, you're barking up the wrong tree." So anyway, they left. But I want to make this short because I don't want to take all Nick's time here. But several years later, in 1961 or 62, I think it was 61, I was lecturing on UFOs. I had moved out of the contactee way of describing my experiences, described them more objectively, because I had wised up to Adamski. And here we are, and I'm watching. There's a lady in the front row, right in the middle, and I noticed she had this enormous wooden purse. And somebody spoke to her, and she turned around. I noticed that there were at least 3 knobs or devices on the back of the purse, which seemed a little odd. Well, when the break came, this lady with the exceptionally large purse with knobs on the back walked right up to me. And she said, "Mr. Stanford, I would like to know what the extraterrestrials, or maybe she said the aliens, have told you about communism. What do they think about communism?" And I think I laughed right in her face. I said, "Look, if I had a contact with a conversation of an alien, I wouldn't be talking to them about communism. I'd want to ask them the things about how their craft is propelled or something else." I said, I've had no such occasion, so I have no idea their view on communism. And so she turned around, I presume cut off the device inside her purse, and that's the story. But I thought you might enjoy that, Nick, because at least I'm a living so-called contactee, and that's what happened to us.
Amazing.
Well, that's really interesting because, I mean, that sort of demonstrates, this angle of how, there was legitimate penetrations of the Russians, but there was also paranoia, that a lot of the contactees were communist as well. But it's interesting you mentioned, about going on the planes and so on, because one of the people who I got, when I was doing the book, one of the people I got files on, I don't know if you ever met her or you knew her name, Sonia Labuchin.
Oh, sure, I knew her very well.
Well, I got hold of her Freedom of Information Act through the Australian government, and she was followed extremely closely. For example, the file talks about a trip she made to the United States in 1959, and it talks about how Australian intelligence, when you read the files, they even had not just the airline she was flying in, but also the actual flight ticket numbers are listed in her surveillance file from Australian intelligence, and primarily it was because number one, she was in touch with George Adamski, who had made a number of controversial statements about communism, but also she was also someone who was born in Yugoslavia, which, at one point was a communist country. And it talks about that in the file as well as to, was she still sort of, having some sort of connection to Yugoslavia, when apparently she wasn't at all. But,
Yes.
This was what was going through the heads of, Australian intelligence.
Amazing.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the subject of Sonia Dubison. May I take a moment and tell about my close encounter with Sonia? Mm-hmm. Okay. We were up at Adamski's, and she was living up there at the time. And she never mentioned communism to us, but she told an amazing story that, I mean, here we are, we were in our teens, our late teens at that point, and we really got a kick out of this, and we didn't buy into it, but she actually told us right in front of Adamski. She said that one night that she named one of the alleged Adamski contacts, I don't know if it was supposed to be a Venusian or a Jupiterian or what, but she called his supposed name that Adamski had in the book, and she said that she and a girlfriend of hers were at a restaurant one night, and 32 aliens, space brothers, she said, came into the restaurant. And they invited these 32 space brothers, or was it 22? I think it was 32, hard to believe. But they invited them over to her or her girlfriend's apartment, and the space brothers said that they needed to be sexually serviced by them to keep their energies up. And she said, we serviced every one of them that night. And I said, Sonia, you're really something.
My God.
Yep,
That's
I've
what you
actually
call
got
a
that,
close
part
encounter.
Of that story in the book.
Wow.
That part of that story is actually in the file.
Is that right? Wow.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, okay, that's great. Well, I'm going to let you go, but I wanted to share that with you. And thank you. I'm really enjoying what you're telling about these things, Nick. Thanks
All
a
right.
lot.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the call, Ray. Talk to you soon. Yeah. Always great hearing from him. So, getting back to the documents, when you were doing a book like this, do you actually collect that first, or as you're going along, does one thing lead into another? How does that work?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit sort of chaotic. You sort of you get a hint of a story, and then you just try and track down all the different portions and the parts to it. But sometimes, they'll come through like a chaotic way, and then you try and when you're sort of satisfied you've gone about as far as you can, then you try and put it all together, sort of, chronologically speaking, and subject speaking, and just try and put the whole picture together. And I never try and anticipate how the investigations are going to go on, because invariably with a subject like UFOs, it's always unpredictable.
Right.
So I just sort of let the story develop as it goes along, and that was sort of what happened. Just the more I dug into it, the more sort of new nuggets of information came through, which would sort of require me to change this chapter or to add to this chapter, because new material was coming through, and it was adding something new to what I assumed was a finished chapter.
Yeah, kind of like piecing a puzzle together in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I see that you touch on the MJ-12 documents, which, of course, for the person that's unfamiliar with them, there was I think it was back in the 1980s. Is that when that was? So these files came to actually a filmmaker or producer or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's been a lot of controversy about those documents. Stan Friedman believed there was a couple of documents that were real. I always get suspicious when there's supposedly any fakes at all in a grouping. It always makes me suspicious. But anyway, so was there some type of connection between the MJ-12 documents and some of the research you were doing on this?
Yeah, this is sort of really controversial area. One of the things I found that the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, when the MJ-12 documents surfaced in the summer of 1987, the DIA were very concerned that the documents were not the real thing, but had been fabricated by Russian intelligence. Now, for people who don't know what the MJ-12 documents are, they surfaced publicly in the summer of 1987, early summer of 1987, from the team of Stan Friedman, who, as we know, sadly passed away a few weeks ago. Stan and Bill Moore, who was the co-author with Charles Berlitz of the book, the Roswell Incidents, and a guy named Jamie Chandray, who worked in the world of entertainment. Now, the documents look like a genuine U.S. government top-secret documents talking about a group called Majestic 12, and how this particular super secret group oversaw the recovery and collection of the wreckage and bodies found at the Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash in the summer of 1947. And during that period, sort of when it was really at its height, kind of 87 to about 89, something like that, there was a lot of interest in the MJ-12 documents and the idea that there's this group called Majestic 12. Now, in the same time frame, a man named Philip Klass, who is a now deceased UFO debunker, he contacted the FBI and said, hey, and also the DIA, and basically said, hey, you know, these documents are circulating which are purported to be leaked documents, and either they're a hoax, and if they're not a hoax and they're leaked, then there's been a leak of classified material, and as the FBI and the DIA, you need to look into it. So that's what they did. Now, the FBI opened, their counterintelligence department opened a file, or an investigation, I should say, into the MJ-12 documents and liaised with the Air Force intelligence and also with the DIA. And they looked at various theories, one being that the documents were the real deal, that there really was an MJ-12, that aliens did crash at Roswell, and so on. That was the one theory. There was a second theory that this was sort of the work of some, you know, weirdo guy, sort of 50-year-old living in his mom and dad's basement, you know, that kind of thing. That was the second theory. But the most intriguing idea or theory was that the documents, the MJ-12 documents, had been created by the KGB, and that the Russians wanted to essentially sort of dangle them in the face of people who worked in the U.S. Department of Defense. And the plan that the Russians supposedly had was to seek out people who worked in the Department of Defense and who also had an interest in UFOs. And the worry that the DIA and the FBI had was that somebody in Russian intelligence would put more and more of these documents together and approach people in the Department of Defense and say, hey, you know, if you give us some legitimate U.S. secrets, we'll give you more and more of these MJ-12 documents. And so the scenario was that these people working in U.S. intelligence who had an interest in UFOs would hand over genuine, legitimate secrets on, you know, military secrets and so on, and in return, all they would get were these fabricated MJ-12 documents from the Russians. That was the legitimate concern that the Defense Intelligence Agency and the FBI had, that there would be this sort of dangling carrot scenario where the Russians would get real stuff from us, and these UFO-obsessed people who happen to work in the Pentagon would get nothing other than fake material. And, you know, and depending on who you speak to this day, you know, I mean, some people still buy into the documents as real, other people think it was a hoax, other people, you know, take alternative views. But what is interesting is that one of the people who was heavily involved in the investigation of the documents was Bruce Maccabee, who is a long-time researcher of the UFO phenomenon. Now, the documents, really, the discussion of them was at its height from sort of 87 to about 89, 90. But Bruce has gone on record as stating that in the early 1990s, he was actually approached by like a Russian attaché working in the United States who was deeply interested in trying to get hold of UFO material, U.S. government material.
Really?
So,
wow.
You know, this kind of makes it sound, as I point out in the book, there's sort of enough material to suggest that a lot of the people like Bill Moore, Stan, Jamie Chandray, and Bruce Maccabee were all being watched to see what their responses were to these MJ-12 documents.
Wow. Well, we're actually out of time, but I wanted to just say this real quickly. This would probably explain, I was in an auction house 2 or 3 years ago, and they were doing an estate, they were selling an estate of a retired FBI agent who passed away. And in his footlocker were the MJ-12 documents, which I thought was really fascinating. But there's that's probably the tie right there. I was trying to figure that one out. actually let
Yeah.
Stan Friedman know about that. He thought it was interesting. But anyway, thanks so much. And anyone can get this book. It's on Amazon. You can get to it on your website, too. Go ahead and throw that out, and then we have to say goodbye.
All right. Well, thanks, Martin. And it's been a
What's your website
good
address?
afternoon.
You have a blog site, right?
I have a blog. Which, if you just type in Nick Redfern World of Whatever, you'll see my blog, and you can reach me at Twitter, Nick Redfern UFO.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nick. It's been a real pleasure,
All
as
right.
always. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Martin.
All right. You take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Okay, everyone, that's it for the show. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Diana Polselka, American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion, and Technology. Should be a wonderful interview. Can't wait for that one. And thanks so much for everyone that helps out with the show. And remember, everyone, keep your eyes to the sky.